This is Philosophy Bites with me, Nigel Warburton.
And me, David Edmonds.
If you enjoy Philosophy Bites, please support us. For details, go to www.philosophybites.com.
Different societies in different parts of the world differ in fundamental ways, but nonetheless agree on certain aspects of morality. No society believes it's acceptable to murder innocent people, for example. Virtues like love and generosity are pretty much universal. Why? What is the origin of this morality? Hanno Sauer of Utrecht University tells an evolutionary story.
Hanno Sauer, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Thank you for having me.
The topic we're going to focus on is the world history of morality. Could you just give us a kind of sense of what the topic is, what it means?
I've always been interested in the sort of genealogical questions in morality, so not to do moral philosophy from the armchair, but to have lots of empirical input and to look at the origins of our norms and values. And then I tried to find a structure for that kind of topic because it's so big, it's so unwieldy, and I tried to come up with some sort of organizing principle for how to make it work, and I think I found a good one.
So obviously Nietzsche is the most famous genealogist of morality. He had a book called The Genealogy of Morality where he purported to explain how we came to have concepts like compassion and guilt and so on. Is what he did different from the kind of thing that you are attempting?
Yeah, it's different. I mean, what I do is obviously inspired by that approach, but I sometimes like to say that what I do is like Nietzsche but true. So I try to update it with the best available modern theories and concepts and ideas and evidence and data and studies. And it comes out different. Different in the sense that the project ends up not being about debunking morality wholesale or a really huge chunk of our morality. Like you said, compassion and empathy and equality and humility, according to Nietzsche, this trick that the weak have pulled on the strong, and I don't think that's true. I think that the history of morality that I want to tell is more vindicatory. A lot of our morality and the way we run our society and our communities turn out to be not so bad, and they allow us to thrive and they allow us to work together. So it's not all about undermining and unmasking morality and making it come out bad and ugly and ignoble.
That's interesting because there is a tradition within philosophy of telling putative stories, stories that might have sort of been true in order to explain where we are now. And I'm thinking of social contract stories, like the sort of story that Rousseau might have told. And there's a sense in which he thought he was telling the truth, but it's speculative history. But what you're doing isn't that. You're trying to be accurate in order to understand, as it were, the etiology of how things came to be as they are.
That's right, but it's sort of in between, I would say. So it's not the Rousseau-Hobbes style of coming up with a sort of fictional template, perhaps, or an abstraction, but that's known to be an abstraction, like it's supposed to be one, right? It's a deliberate abstraction, a deliberate foil against which to compare the present, perhaps, and to make a normative point about what could be acceptable or what could have been acceptable and so on and so on. So it's not that. At the same time, I try to say things that I think can be supported and that are not made up and speculative in a bad sense, but much of it is speculative in the sense of you kind of have to triangulate from different disciplines. It's going to be a lot of speculation about what maybe happened or what plausibly happened, and you just reconstruct a likely history. But it's not very historical in the sense of here are some events and some dates and some names of concrete and specific people and places and so on and so on. So it's speculative in some sense, but it's still supposed to be serious and solid.
This is probably an unfair question, but could you just give a sense of what the big picture is here? What is the story of morality? Where did it come from?
I think the big picture is that morality, and this is not new, obviously, morality is about how we secure the benefits of cooperation. A lot of people are put off by that because they think it sounds sort of functionalist, but I'm not very impressed by that. I think morality has to be basically functional. It has to do something for us, otherwise it would vanish. And it couldn't be perfectly unstable. It couldn't be perfectly dysfunctional. So there must be some connection between cooperative functioning and morality. I think that's very plausible. And then the big through line that I have on the genealogy of morality is that it's largely about scaling up cooperation and finding mechanisms that allow us to get cooperation off the ground and scale it up to build ever larger groups. Now, living in larger groups isn't always progress. It's not always guaranteed to be an improvement. But I think by and large, we see that the history of human cooperation is one of human groups getting larger and us figuring out the institutional scaffolding to make that happen.
So is this a positive story of the widening circle, as it were? I mean, Heracles had this idea that, we start off with the morality of relating to our loved ones, the nearest and dearest, broaden it out to friends, to our village, to the city, and hopefully eventually to the cosmos. But it's a kind of optimistic story of progress. Is that something like your story?
Yeah, I think when you think about philosophers like Peter Singer, for instance, the term the expanding circle is older, and it was coined in the 19th century, but it's been really popularized in its modern usage, I think, by Peter Singer. And it's a good idea. But I think what I try to do, or what I'm very keen on, is to sort of lay the foundations for why that happens. And I think the scaling up cooperation idea is one that sort of explains fundamentally what's going on. The expanding circle kind of falls out of the sky in Singer, just sort of like we just, started to reason for some reason at some point, but the timing is totally unclear. We've been capable of reasoning for a long time, but all of a sudden we start to realize that animals deserve moral consideration and so on and so on. That's very unclear. I think the dynamic is one where we figure out the institutions and the cultural practices to have larger groups and the social toolkit that requires, but the expanding circle is a big element of the story.
So that is completely anti-Hobbesian. Hobbes thought that we are basically self-interested, selfish individuals, and we make cooperative decisions, but ultimately we need an overarching political force to keep us under control. Otherwise, we revert to the state of nature.
I think the story that I have to offer is sort of halfway between left Hobbesianism and left Hegelianism. What Hobbes got right is the basic strategic logic of collective action. It's not the claim about anthropology that we are self-interested, because we're not, but it's the underlying strategic logic that made us cooperative. So we are Rousseauian for Hobbesian reasons, so to speak. And the left Hegelian part comes in because I'm very, very interested and fascinated and impressed by recent work on cultural evolution. And I think there is a lot to a kind of modern naturalistic update to this objective spirit idea, right? You don't have this like divine puppet master that runs history. But I think there are supra-individual, genuinely social processes that are above and beyond individual reasoning and understanding and transparency that matter a lot for humanity and human life and the kind of being that we are. And I think cumulative cultural evolution is the way to think about that. So that's what makes it left Hegelian a little bit. And the left, I say, because it's supposed to have a moderate progressive message. That's the one that's borne out best by the data, is that human beings thrive in larger groups with liberty and equality and so on and so on. That tends to work out best for people rather than division and ethnocentrism and conflict and so on and so on.
Probably for most people on the planet still, morality comes from God or gods. Yours is a secular story, is that right?
That's right. Sometimes people want to say that these two kinds of approaches can be reconciled, but I don't think that. I'm one of these really annoying, straight-up atheists who think it's made up. It's like Santa Claus. Sometimes I like to say that they couldn't have found out on Mount Sinai that not supposed to murder each other, right? Because they had to get there, right? They couldn't have torn each other apart on the way to the instructions. It must be, in the broadest sense, naturalistically respectable story, and that's the one that I want to tell.
So where do virtues like generosity, compassion, love and its various manifestations come from?
Yeah, I think that thinking about morality in these naturalistic terms is always going to be inspired by evolutionary thinking. It could be biological evolution, it could be cultural evolution. And evolutionary thinking has this reverse theodicy problem, right? So theodicy has to reconcile a kind and well-informed deity with suffering. But here with evolution, we have the opposite. All of a sudden, it's altruism and kindness that becomes tough to explain. And it's ruthlessness and egoism that seems natural, right? So you get the opposite problem. But I think unlike theism, evolution has made great progress at actually supplying plausible, precise explanations for where these different virtues come from. So you have a plausible story for where altruism and kindness comes from that's based on kin selection. You have very plausible stories for where love comes from pair bonding and child rearing and so on and so on. So you can supply not just a general explanation for the origins of morality, but also for these particular virtues. Generosity could be due to getting the right balance when it comes to reciprocating cooperation and cooperative benefits and so on and so on. So I think we can provide very plausible evolutionary explanations for these virtues and morality in general.
Some of those, I agree, you can see biological, physiological, cultural explanations, but that doesn't explain why this would go beyond our kin, why it would go beyond the people right in front of me. We have easy cultural explanations of small group dynamics, but how do you move this to a global level?
Yeah, I think that's really tricky. But also notice that ever since the idea of natural selection was first articulated, people have said, this idea can't explain that. Ever since then, it's been a long history of successes of evolutionary theory turning out to be able to explain the thing that allegedly it would be incapable of explaining. And I think with this phenomenon of a highly inclusive morality that goes beyond kin, goes beyond blood, and extends kindness and empathy and altruism and cooperative dispositions to strangers, generalized cooperation towards anyone, we do now have a very, very plausible explanation for where that comes from. That is based on cultural evolutionary theory, and perhaps the main person to bring up here is Joseph Henrich's theory of the origins of weird people and the kind of institutional toolkit that made that possible. It's been a really core question for social thinkers of all stripes where the modern world comes from. And you have the racist explanation, right? It's like the white man just knows better. You have maybe the Max Weber angle, that it's something about the impact of religion on modern institutions and the economy and on capitalism. And the Weber, Durkheim, Talcott Parsons, Niklas Luhmann story, they all have some sort of point, but I think it's been only very recently that we have an extremely well-supported theory of where the modern world comes from. And I think the correct account is Joseph Henrich's The Weirdest People in the World, where he tries to show that basically the whole package of modern morality, moral universalism, liberalism, individualism, the is-ought gap, analytical thinking, not just the expanding circle of moral status, but also the contracting circle of moral responsibility, right? We have an expanding circle and a contracting circle where people aren't responsible for accidents. People are not responsible for things they did when they were incapacitated, for instance. So you have that circle that's not expanding, but shrinking. Bearers of responsibility become smaller. So that whole package of modern normativity and modern morality seems to be due to the fact that for some reason, around 500, 600 in the early Middle Ages, the Western Church started to destroy the kinship structures of Western and Central Europe by forbidding certain forms of inheritance, by banning cousin marriage, first cousins, second cousins, up to fifth and sixth cousins, thereby destroying these clan structures that are the fundamental organizing principle of society everywhere. And that created space for new institutions that are not based on blood, but on voluntary commitment. And you get monasteries, you get cities, you get clubs, you get companies, you get universities, all of which arrange cooperation fundamentally on non-kinship principles. And that created the modern world. And it just creates this package that comes with a kind of impersonal pro-sociality that you need when you want to run a modern state and a modern market economy. You need to be basically happy to cooperate with anyone. It's very imperfect, of course, but in principle, when you want to get rich, you're happy to trade with anyone. The skin color is fundamentally irrelevant to profit, for instance, or to running a bureaucracy or an administration in a state and so on and so on. And so that generates that bias in a direction of a fully expanded circle of morality. And then once you have that cognitively, you remove speciesism and other types of things, and you get the fully generalized morality, I think.
So is your conclusion that there is a kind of universal morality, that it may appear local and diverse, but actually there are overarching principles, something like the golden rule almost, that you should treat others as you would want to be treated yourself, applies for a combination of evolutionary and pragmatic reasons?
I think moral universalism is underrated. I see this in my students. The one idea that they really reject, all the others, anti-natalism, infanticide, whatever, giving away all your money, they think, oh, it's interesting, let's hear the argument. But when you come with, we may have a universal morality, they really don't want to hear that. So it's very, very deeply, I think, culturally entrenched that it almost couldn't possibly be true that there are universal moral values. I think that psychologically and historically that's kind of understandable because universalism has so often been abused to kind of export the good news to other cultures, and then when they don't want to hear it, we started slaughtering them or abusing them. So it's understandable, but I think just because moral universalism, like most ideas, can be abused doesn't mean that the idea itself is false. I think there's empirically a lot in support of it. When we go out to different cultures, usually we see that they live sort of superficially different, but fundamentally we always recognize the moral ideas and virtues that they have. They may have different priorities, and they may live a very different life, but the kind of fundamental relativism that we have been sold, we don't really find.
How then do you account for evil? The counter force, as it were, that is so destructive and causes so much suffering and turns people into non-people very quickly.
When you tell a story about the origins of morality, you sort of tell a story about the origins of good and evil. So I think often the answer to what's evil is just sort of like you take the story about what's good and then sort of it implies something about the negative. We can say more about what are the forces that lead to dehumanization of people, for instance. And it's going to be complex. It can sometimes be greed. It can sometimes be ideology. It can sometimes be conformism. There are all sorts of forces that make people do bad things. Very powerful forces, because these things like narratives that we tell to justify the status quo or conformism are very, very powerful, and no one is immune to them. So that's why you find evil so often. But I think one underappreciated case is that often you find when societies misfunction or don't function for the common good so much, you often see that you have a small elite that helps themselves to oppression and exploitation, and often just also bizarre mistreatment like human sacrifice or foot binding and so on and so on, just pointless cruelty that is inflicted by a small group of people who are powerful and isolated from revolution or critique or accountability, and they permit themselves to do crazy stuff to the rest of society.
But isn't this some kind of counter-argument to the general picture that you painted of humanity evolving as cooperative, rational beings who learn how to live with one another?
Yeah, it puts quite a bit of pressure on that story. I think it still works, but definitely it remains true that evolution doesn't optimize, and you can often have like an invasion of bad ideas and bad practices that then stick around. And the rest of society can become unable to get rid of them because they have like a first mover problem, a coordination problem when it comes to wanting to get rid of these things. So take foot binding again. It would be hard to come up with something that is more pointless and less justified. There's literally nothing in support of disabling your wives. And it's stuck around for 1,000 years. It probably evolved as something like maybe a decorative, erotic ritual that some upper class guy came up with, and then it spread out as like a trend. And then it became more and more extreme, and people got caught up in that kind of status signaling competition where everyone had to do it. And if you didn't do it, you were kind of suspicious. You also wanted to convey the message that you could afford to disable your wife because you were literally making it impossible to do any interesting work. And then it just sticks around, and it's very, very hard to organize a social movement that gets rid of that. And you need often historical accidents or just something that happens that shakes this up, and often it can unravel very, very quickly. It's right that the sort of optimistic genealogy that I have to offer wants to still be able to take seriously the possibility that really bizarre and cruel and bad things happen that are very hard to get rid of, and they stick around for a very, very long time. I do think that ultimately there are forces in society that put pressure on these things because it is harmful, it is cruel. Often it's also something that people really don't want to participate in, right? So you get that kind of preference falsification, as people sometimes say, where everyone does it because they think everyone else thinks you should do it, right? But really no one wants to disable their daughters, but people are stuck in these toxic situations. But ultimately, I think they do tend to become unstable after a while. And the direction of change is sort of in the direction of creating societies that work out better for everyone on more egalitarian terms.
Look, I can imagine somebody listening to this and saying, well, you're just an Enlightenment thinker. That's just what they thought in the Enlightenment. Universal ethics, if we just understood enough about the nature of other societies, we would see that basically we're all part of this humanity with the same values. But surely we're past that, we're post-Enlightenment, as you've already suggested. We see the kind of colonial ways of thinking are often presented as universalist, but are actually very much power games in relation to people who are radically different from us.
I mean, it sounds so pretentious to say, but I would say I'm an Enlightenment thinker. The stuff I do stands in that tradition. Much of it is unfairly maligned. There are many ideas worth defending. I also want to remain able to appreciate the following rejoinder. It's not a coincidence that a white, rich, heterosexual, well-educated man would think that society works all right. I think that is a good point. And I can very much see that many people belong to groups for which society does not work out so well. There's a little bit of a footnote to the whole story, which is how convenient that you think that. Wouldn't you think that, right? Being the kind of person that you are. And I think that's something to take seriously. And so I always try to make sure that I don't miss that kind of worry. Now, the story that I tell still does come out kind of Enlightenment-ish. Maybe I'm just too biased to see past that.
One last question, I think. What's the best critique you've had of your ideas? What's the most difficult one to answer?
So I think there are basically two. One is that it is difficult to reconcile two fundamentally different perspectives on morality and thinking. It's one thing to have a kind of observer perspective on thinking, where you provide a causal explanation of where our thoughts come from, where our practices come from, and where our norms and values come from. But you explain where they come from. You don't judge whether they are good or not. That's the genealogy part. Here are the origins of our moral norms and values. And the other perspective is more like a participant perspective, where you are in the game, right? And you take the rules of thinking and logic and morality and normativity and right and wrong, you take them actually seriously, because you are playing the game, you're not just explaining where that game comes from. And the question is, what is the relation between the two? If you go in the genealogical direction and you come up with a causal explanation for these phenomena, are you thereby saying that the playing the game perspective, the actually taking the rules seriously, is a mistake? Is it an illusion? Or is there some relationship of one is actually more fundamental? And I don't really have a final answer to what's the relation between explaining where something comes from and having a perspective on taking it seriously, what you are doing and what's moral and what's logical and what's rational.
And what's the second criticism that you've had to face?
I think the second big thing that I'm also not entirely final on is when you take a genealogical perspective on the origins of our moral norms and values, you are telling a story about change and transformation and contingency, accident and luck, basically. When you then want to end up defending a version of moral universalism, that's kind of awkward, because you're combining a point about morality is universal at a fundamental level with a story about morality is changing all the time, and how can both be true? I think it can be made to work, but I see why that would be a tension and why that would be problematic, and that's something that people bring up a lot.
Hanno Sauer, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, it was really fun.
You've been listening to Philosophy Bites. This episode was made in association with the Institute of Philosophy and supported by the Ideas Workshop, part of Open Society Foundations. For more Philosophy Bites, go to philosophybites.com.